We continue our study, Simply Significant, how God shapes ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. And the first thing that God uses to help shape us is that he does so with patience. You cannot rush things. Both Moses and David had to learn to wait upon God. Moses knew that God had made him into a man whom Stephen describes in the book of Acts as learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. That's Acts 7:22. So, with the knowledge of his gifts and a passion for his people, Moses took action. Listen to what Stephen says here in verses 23 through 29. Now, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart, that's Moses' heart, to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. The next day he appeared to two of them as they were fighting and tried to reconcile them, saying, Men, you are brethren. Why do you wrong one another? But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? Then, at this saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. Moses acted impetuously by worldly ingenuity and fleshly energy, and it blew up in his face. God's work must be done God's way. It also requires his timing. God never is late. He never is early. He's always right on time. God's not bound by our calendar, so it would take 40 years for Moses to develop patience and get ready for what God would do through him. Just listen again to verse number 30. And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. Now, I'm not trying to say that it's going to take 40 years before God can use you, but it might. But whatever it takes for God to develop patience in you, you need that patience. You need it in a hurry. Oh, this meant Moses was 80 years old when God set him apart for that task that he had originally designed for him. Listen to me. You're never too old for God to use. David, on the other hand, was also assured of God's call in his life, but it was at an early age. Saul had disqualified himself from being king. So God sought a man after his own heart and sent Samuel to find the new king from among Jesse's sons. The obvious choices were rejected. All that remained was this scrawny young lad named David, and he was God's choice. Now, David was on the opposite end of the age spectrum from Moses. He was probably a teenager. You're never too young for God to use. With Moses, never too old. With David, never too young. Yet, David would have to wait. He would need patience as God worked in his life and readied the circumstances for him to be king. The raging, demonized King Saul would do all that he could to stop God's plan. He chased David all over the Judean wilderness. David barely evaded capture. Twice he had opportunity to kill Saul, but would not take matters into his own hands. He waited on the Lord. God has a plan for your life. And whether you're 18 like David or 80 like Moses, we need to learn to wait on God's timing. Patience is a virtue that we need in order to be faithful and fruitful for the Lord. Just think about the difference between a flower that suddenly springs up, doesn't have too deep roots, produces a beautiful petals, a fragrance for a little while, and then it's gone. But then compare that flower to a fruit tree. Here's a fruit tree that at first, when it begins to grow, produces no fruit. In fact, it takes several years of maturity and those roots going down deep and those branches spreading upward and outward to that first fruit begins to be produced. And then later, as the tree matures, even more and more fruit is produced. Well, I guess the question is, do you want to be a flower that's quickly cut off, whose impact is briefly known, or do you want to be simply significant in that you put down roots deep and you grow up? Well, it takes time. It requires patience. There's the difference. So, let me ask you some questions. As you think about a potter shaping a vessel from the clay, that also, if you've ever worked with clay, is not something that you can rush. It takes a little bit of time, the proper amount of pressure, the formation of that clay for it to develop into a vessel. Well, God's the potter and we're the clay. And God will be patient in developing us. Will you be patient in receiving His work as that human clay? Now, here's some things for you to think about. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being most impatient and 5 being very patient, where would you rate yourself on the patience level? How patient are you? Now, can you think of some times that impatience got you into trouble? Think about those. Then I would encourage you to read James chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. What are the truths concerning patience that we observe in that passage? That should be some fruitful thought and conversation. We'll continue on this in our next video.